You know, it's funny how some of history's biggest turning points don't come from times of strength and confidence. Nope, they often come from moments of absolute crisis. An unexpected shock can force a whole civilization to adapt, to change, and, well, to get a whole lot stronger than it ever was before. And today we're going to dive into one of the most incredible examples of this, the story of ancient Egypt and the so-called foreign rulers known as the Hyksos. It sounds totally backward, right? I mean, how can getting overthrown, split apart, and ruled by outsiders possibly be a good thing? But that's the big question we're tackling today, because the answer shows us how a period of total humiliation became the very thing that launched Egypt's greatest imperial age. So, to understand how the Hyksos even got a foothold, we first have to get a picture of Egypt before they arrived. And let me tell you, this was not the all-powerful, unified kingdom of the Great Pyramids that we usually think of. Not at all. Yeah, the pharaoh's central authority was, let's just say it was falling apart at the seams. You had local rulers in different parts of the country getting stronger and more independent, and the whole kingdom just wasn't being controlled from one single place anymore. And what happens when there's a power vacuum? Well, a divided Egypt became a vulnerable Egypt. It was basically the perfect setup for an outside group to just walk in and take over. And right into that vacuum stepped a new power. These folks would completely change Egypt's entire destiny, challenging its identity and pushing it down a path it had never ever been on before. So who exactly were these Hyksos people? Well, the name itself gives us a pretty big clue. It comes from an Egyptian phrase, Hekau, which translates to rulers of foreign lands. Now here's the important part. This wasn't one single nation or some unified army. It was a diverse mix of people, likely from Western Asia, who trickled into the Nile Delta over a really long time. Now, this is where it gets really interesting when we look at the myth versus the reality. See, later on, the Egyptian pharaohs who kicked them out wrote their own history, which was basically propaganda. They painted this picture of the Hyksos as this brutal, savage horde that just showed up one day and destroyed everything. But the real story? It seems to be way more complicated. It was more like a slow burn, a gradual migration, people settling down, and then slowly, over time, grabbing more and more political power. Their home base was a city called Avaris, right in the Nile Delta. And man, what a strategic move that was. Avaris wasn't your typical Egyptian city. It was this buzzing, cosmopolitan hub that plugged Egypt right into the major trade routes and cultures of the Near East. This gave the Hyksos access to people, goods, and most importantly, new ideas and technologies that the more traditional, isolated parts of Egypt down south just didn't have. And you know, some of the most critical new ideas they brought with them, they were all about warfare. The whole Hyksos period is tied directly to a technological revolution that would change the Egyptian military forever. The Hyksos are the ones who get the credit for bringing in, or at least popularizing, some total game changers for the military. We're talking about the horse, for one, and then advanced new weapons like the composite bow. But the most famous of all, the fast, light, horse-drawn chariot. To really get how huge this was, you gotta remember that before this, Egyptian armies were basically just guys on foot. I mean, the chariot was basically the ancient world's version of a tank. It completely flipped the script on the battlefield. It gave warriors incredible speed and mobility, and you can just imagine the psychological terror it caused. This single piece of technology, made famous by the Hyksos, would go on to become the absolute signature weapon of the powerful New Kingdom pharaohs who came next. But look, the Hyksos weren't just warriors. They were rulers, too. And this is key. They didn't try to just erase Egyptian culture. Actually, it was the opposite. They adapted to it. They started calling themselves pharaohs, they used the existing Egyptian government systems, and they kind of blended their own traditions with the local ones. So this was a really complex cultural exchange, not just simple destruction. But no matter how much they tried to fit in, they were still seen as foreign rulers by the native Egyptians who were holding on to power down south. And a divided country like that, it just couldn't last. A backlash was pretty much inevitable. Okay, so here's the setup. You've got the Hyksos up in the north, ruling out of their international hub, Avaris. And then, way down south, you have a line of native Egyptian rulers based in the traditional heartland of Thebes, just waiting, building up their strength. This was the ultimate showdown, a massive conflict for the very soul of Egypt. And that conflict exploded into a war of liberation that spanned generations. It all started with a Theban king named Sequenener Tau, who probably died fighting them. Then his son Chamos picked up the torch and kept pushing north. And finally, it was his brother Ahmose I who managed to succeed, driving the Hyksos out for good and reuniting all of Egypt under his rule. But this victory, this wasn't about hitting the reset button and going back to the good old days. Kicking the Hyksos out didn't just restore the old Egypt. It created something brand new, something way more powerful and aggressive than anything that had come before. The direct result was the birth of the new kingdom. This is the Egypt of legend. We're talking about the era of incredible pharaohs like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, and Ramesses the Great. This was Egypt's imperial age, a time of unbelievable wealth, power, and massive expansion. And this new kingdom Egypt was just fundamentally different. It was way more militarized, now armed with those very same chariots the Hyksos had made so famous. It was expansionist, dead set on creating a buffer zone and controlling foreign lands so that an invasion could never, ever happen again. In a way, Egypt had learned a hard lesson from its enemy. The trauma of being dominated had forced it to become a dominator itself. Which brings us all the way back to our big question at the start. Were the Hyksos just a terrible disaster for Egypt? I mean, the Egyptians who came after them certainly thought so, but when you really look at what happened next, well, the picture gets a lot more complicated. The Hyksos period was, without a doubt, a crisis. It was a time of division and foreign rule that deeply shocked the Egyptian psyche. But it was also a powerful lesson. That shock forced Egypt to modernize its military, to completely rethink its place in the world, and to build a state so powerful it became an empire. It was a painful, transformative experience that ultimately forged a stronger, tougher Egypt from the ashes of its own division. In the end, the crisis created the empire.